so today we're going to wrap up this series, and what you're going to find is here's essentially what a series looks like. We take an idea from the gospel, we kind of pour it all out, and it's all kind of laying there, and then we begin to batch those things that are similar. And as we put those together, we create weeks that will tell a story to the end. And when we get to the end, we just basically have everything in a nice orderly fashion that we then pick up and we put back in the box so that the box has handles, and we can carry these ideas with us so we can actually live out the things that we live in the gospel. It's awesome to just study the gospel. It's awesome to just know things, but it is far greater to do the things that we know than just hold on to the things that we know. So today will be a lot of familiar concepts that we've been laying out. There have been a few loose ends, and we'll pick those up and put those in the box as well. And so when we wrap this up today, we will be a people committed to live our part in being a Joshua generation. So kind of take it back from the top. God Almighty, who loved his people, who made a promise to his people, saw his people suffering in Egypt. He saw how they were being exploited. He saw how they were being abused, and he had mercy on them. And he appeared to a man who was 80 years old. This man's name was Moses. Moses was married. He had children. He was a shepherd at the time. He's just out in the wilderness, keeping his livestock, doing his thing, when he noticed a bush that was burning, but it wasn't on fire. It was burning, but it wasn't being consumed. And so he turned from his work for long enough to pay attention to a move of God. He paused from his labor, from what was distracting him from seeing the fullness of a move of God, so that he could focus on what God was doing. In the middle of putting himself in that moment, the voice of God came to him and said, "Moses, take off your shoes because you're on holy ground." God will always encourage us to lay aside the thing that is standing between us, recognizing the fullness of his power. When there's something that we are hanging on to and we get in the presence of God, he will ask us to lay that aside so that we can experience all that he is. So Moses and God begin to have this conversation. And then Moses says, well, who will I tell people that you are? I mean, if I go tell them all this stuff and they say, well, who sent you? Who do I say? And God breathed out 4 letters. Yahweh. The breath of God. Yahweh. Yahweh sent you. And while this was going on, just 40 years before that-ish, a man named Nun, a child of God, someone of the family whom God says are my people, whom I will set apart. Nun was living beneath his privilege as a child of God. He was a slave. He lived in captivity, as it were. His people couldn't even go out to the wilderness and worship God. He had a son, and he gave his newborn son a name, Hoshea. And Hoshea watched his dad Nun do all this work, do all this labor, and never have anything to show for it. And then he would become old enough where it would be his turn now to live in such a way where he would work hard and have nothing to show for it. Sometimes we get stuck in cycles. Not because we have to be in that cycle, just sometimes we can't see anything else. It's what we've always seen, so it's what we continue to do. Fast forward a little bit of time. Now Moses, the one who met God at the burning bush, now he comes into the world where Hoshea is living. And now this Moses introduces to all of these people this idea that God has seen you and God has heard you, and he wants to bring you from this place where you are to his promised land. And all the people, including Hoshea, believed what Moses told them. Hoshea followed the cloud of God, the fire of God, all the way to safety. When God parted the Red Sea, by faith, Hoshea walked across dry ground. He stepped into the wilderness of all of his people. And Moses led them into the base of the mountain. He was there when the 10 Commandments were given. In fact, Hoshea was so faithful in all that he did, he was made the assistant of Moses. And one day, after wandering a little bit, after following the cloud and the fire, they came to the Jordan River. They came to this place where the promised land was on the other side. And God did an extraordinary thing with Hoshea. He changed his name. And Moses, for the very first time, called Hoshea Yeshua. Because his name would no longer mean salvation. His name would now mean Yahweh is salvation. Embedded in his name was the plan of God. He would go on and he would live and he would become the next leader of God's people. His name would be such that parents would want to name their children after him because they saw all that was in him and they wanted to make that declaration over their children. It's interesting, we fast forward a few years, many years, to a point where the Word of God became flesh and would dwell among us. And he was given a name. In Hebrew, Yeshua, which was then translated into Greek, which was then translated into Latin, which then comes to us as Jesus. The name above every name. The name where every enemy must bow. The name where every single person's tongue will confess. Why? Because Jesus Christ is Lord. Salvation over all. And so in the middle of this study, all we can see is Jesus. All we can see is the goodness of God that he has laid out for us to understand so that we can do those things that he's demonstrated for us. So let's jump into this. We're going to wrap this up in Joshua chapter 24, verse 11. They've conquered all the land. They're standing here and Joshua's giving his last address. And he says, you went over the Jordan. You did. And came to Jericho. And the leaders of Jericho fought against you. And also the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And I gave them into your hand. And I sent the hornet before you, which drove them out before you. The 2 kings of the Amorites, it was not by your sword or by your bow. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities that you had not built, and you dwell in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant. Now therefore, fear the Lord, and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and to Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. God had given them all this victory. God had caused his enemies to fall before him. They had conquered everything that God had given them to conquer. And at the end of it, this is his command. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua was considered one of the greatest leaders of that time. And it was never about him. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Let's take this back from the top. What did he say? He said in this beginning, he said, it was you who crossed the river Jordan. You did that. Do you realize there was a generation before them that was not willing to do that? In every generation, we are going to be asked to do things that maybe no other generation has done, but it's not that no other generation had the opportunity, did not have the opportunity to do it. Someone did have the opportunity to cross the Jordan. They came all the way there. They just said no. The difference between the generation before and that generation, they said yes. There must be a certain urgency in us when God places opportunity before us that this opportunity might not come again. I know sometimes in our conversation we have gotten so lazy that we think everything, we're always going to have a second chance. We're always going to have a third chance to do this or do that or get this right. The generation before them didn't have that second chance. There was one opportunity to cross the Jordan, they wouldn't take it. Joshua's generation walked across. They saw opportunity that was in front of them. They recognized it for what it was, and they would not say no to God. They would not say no to God. The answer of their generation was simply yes. So I don't know how many opportunities we get. God is long-suffering. We certainly can have sometimes with some things multiple opportunities, but what happens is we take that idea and we project this notion that God gave me a third, fourth, fifth chance, so I really don't have to do this right now because I might have another chance to do it again. We are then living a lifestyle where we're wanting to excuse ourselves from following God. Could we just go ahead and decide, rather than spend energy figuring out how to not obey God, that our energy will be spent, our focus will be spent on actually obeying Him? We spend so much effort trying to construct theologies and ideas that basically tell us we don't have to serve God. Could we just go ahead and accept this notion that we should serve God? And therefore, when we are asked to do something, we should just go ahead and do it. Jesus told a parable of a man who was very wealthy in many things, and he was talking about all the stuff that he was going to build, and he was going to put all of his stuff in this barn and in that barn. And all of a sudden it came to him, said, "You idiot, you're going to die tonight." Right? The one thing that you need to get right, you're not even worried about. You're worried about all these other things. There is a thing, there is a yes in our generation that if we don't say yes to, it'll wait until the next one. It'll wait. There are certain things in family we only get the opportunity to be there for once. The birth of our child. They'll never be born in that way again. Get one shot. One shot to be there. Get one shot at that first wedding. Like one shot to get it right. You don't get to replay that. One shot to honor your parents in that certain way. You get one shot. You won't get to bury them again. One opportunity. There are moments in our lives that happen once, and we need to embrace the urgency of what is in front of us. Because apathy is a killer. Apathy tells us it doesn't matter. Apathy tells us it'll swing back around. Apathy tells us I can eventually get to it. What if you can't? When Joshua's generation came up to the water, they just said yes. They said yes. Moses had an opportunity to use his voice for God. He said no. God gave him Aaron. He gave him a crutch, if you will. And then decades later would go by and God says, I need to use your voice. I need you to command the rock. Now hear me. Moses in this space here said no. God gave him a crutch. Fast forward a few decades, God gives him the same command. The problem, it seems, is that Moses didn't sense the urgency of this moment because he thought, well, God just let me get away with it here. So He will just always let me get away with it. There are things that God has let you get away with that you weren't ready for when He first started working on you about them. But now after years, you know what? The excuses are gone. The time is up. Now is the moment to obey God. And Moses said, no, I will not use my voice in that way. And it cost him. He did not get to go into the promised land. He did not get to go into the promised land. Now Joshua saw the whole thing. So now we have Joshua living in the promised land. Joshua in a generation, we're going from battle to battle to battle to battle. And then we see Joshua in this moment of prayer with the Lord, and things are really needing to take a turn. The enemy that had gathered against them was greater than their own forces. And in prayer, God gave Joshua a plan. And Joshua then stood in front of all the children of Israel. Remember, Moses would not uphold God as holy when he would not give a command with his mouth in front of the people of Israel. Now Joshua has been given the task of giving a verbal command in front of the people of Israel. He had seen Moses not get that right. Therefore, he was going to make sure that he got it right. Could we please quit repeating the mistakes of the ones who've gone before us? Let us learn from their victories. Let us learn from their mistakes. Let's turn those mistakes into victories for our generation. And so Joshua, having a full understanding of this, it said he stood before the people and declared. He did not pray. He didn't swing a stick. He didn't do anything other than declare before the people, "Sun, stand still." I don't know about you, but I'd rather command a rock to give water than sun stand still. But in that place of prayer, God gave him a command. And when he stood before the people, it didn't matter what it looked like, and it didn't matter how impossible it seemed. All that mattered was God gave him a command and he was going to obey it. And what did he declare? Sun, stand still. Now here's where we go from prayer to prophecy. He didn't pray for the sun to stand still. In that place of prayer, he had questions. In that place of prayer, he needed wisdom. In that place of prayer, there was that relationship with God. And in that communion with God and in that conversation with God, God gave Joshua the answer. Once he had the answer, he didn't need to pray about the answer anymore. All he needed to do was make the declaration that God has made. Some of us have heard things in prayer, but we haven't declared the answer yet. We need to understand how to transition a moment from a prayer moment to a prophetic moment. When we are in prayer because we have questions, we need to stay there until we have the answers. Too many of us just pray about our own prophecy, step away from the prayer moment, and say what we want to be. Just because you said it doesn't make it prophecy. If we didn't get an answer in prayer, we don't start prophesying until we get an answer. When we stay in prayer, we will hear from God. One of the reasons why most of us don't hear from God is we don't pray. When you spend time in prayer, when you spend time waiting on God, guess what? God will answer you. James told us clearly, if anybody lacks wisdom, let him ask, because God gives liberally to all. Right? So when we're in that place of confusion, when we're in that place where we don't understand what to do, we stay in prayer until we receive an answer. When we receive the answer, those words are what we call prophecy. We step from that prayer place. Now we step into the situation and we prophesy. We are not commanding God to do anything. We are simply repeating what he said he would do. Joshua did not demand God to hold the sun. He commanded the sun to obey the will of God. Prophecy will always command the situation to be obedient to the power of God. There was a moment that they had to live out. There was a moment that they had to see that would be a model for the generations that would follow. What can we experience that hasn't been experienced before? What can you see in your household that maybe you haven't seen before? In Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, it says it like this. Moses was talking to the people. And he was having this conversation with God. He says, God fed you with manna, which you did not know, and which your fathers did not know, that I might make you know that man will not live by bread alone, but man will live by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Now, they were in a season where they were in the wilderness. They were in a season where they weren't seeing the fullness of the promise. They were on their way from slavery to the promised land. They had left what was miserable. They'd stepped into what was testing their patience, we'll say, and they hadn't stepped yet into the promise. And in that place, God was giving them something that would sustain them going from here to here. Now, when we're in a season that is sustaining us, what gives us the excitement isn't that we're being sustained, but what gives us excitement is that God is doing something. I'm sure they weren't excited about wandering in the wilderness, but they should have been excited about walking to the promised land. There are times in our lives where we're in a season where we've planted something and we don't see it growing yet. We don't see anything happening. We've just placed the seed in the ground. Why am I thrilled at a barren piece of land? Because God said, whatever you sow, you are going to reap. So I can declare over that land that I have sown into, grow. Right? Who's making it grow? God is. My confidence isn't in my sowing. My confidence is that God is making it grow. But I know that He'll make it grow because I obeyed in sowing. So even though I don't see it, I command anyhow. I prophesy anyhow. Why? Because I have His word. So when I'm prophesying growth and I see a harvest where there isn't one, I don't wander around in frustration. I don't wander around in a place of complaining because I know God is moving. See, this is the other thing. They crossed the river, then he said, and you came to Jericho. You took Jericho. How did they do that differently than the battles that the generations before them had faced? They didn't complain. God said, I want you to march around 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, and then 7 times on the 7th day. And they were not complaining. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 9 says, do not put Jesus to the test by complaining as they did, and they were destroyed by the destroyer. There was a group of people who complained, and they died in the wilderness, destroyed by the destroyer. But the next generation would step forward, and they walked around once and saw nothing. And they walked around twice and saw nothing. And they walked around 3 times and saw nothing. But their expectation and anticipation was in what God was going to do, not in what they were seeing. We will always have the tendency to complain when we don't see the thing that we want to see. I am a recovering complainer. I'm not a recovered complainer. I'm a recovering complainer. And it's interesting, I was in a parenting lecture the other day, and the guy said, you know, we don't have to teach our kids to complain. I don't know why that struck me, but I thought, yeah, we don't. They just naturally do that, right? There are things, because we come from a fallen world, that are just in us that we have to renew our minds to get out of. Complaining is one of them. Complaining will keep a generation from experiencing the fullness of God. I don't care if you don't see it yet. If God says you will see it, don't complain about it. Just stay faithful because you will one day see. They did not complain about marching around Jericho. And then he says, you fought kings. Now this is kind of a big one. Because a lot of times in Christianity, we see even moments in the Bible where God fought battles for them and they did nothing but just go stand on a hill. But that was the minority of the battles. If God says He's going to fight a battle for you and you have to do nothing, then you stand on that. But if He doesn't say that and a battle shows up, don't do nothing thinking God is going to fight the battle. Engage in the process that God has given you to engage in. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12 says we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and evil cosmic forces in heavenly places. There's battle to be done. There are wars to be waged, but our battle isn't with the person that's getting on our nerves that's in front of us. Our battle is the spirit that's motivating them to steal from us the joy of God. When you step into work after having an amazing weekend and somebody comes over and drips on you, they didn't come over and drip on you because they're miserable. They came over and dripped on you because the enemy hates that you experience joy all weekend. And he would like to distract you from walking in the joy of the Lord. Because when we walk in the joy of the Lord, we talk as if we're living in the joy of the Lord. And we smile as if we're living in the joy of the Lord. And then goodness just begins to follow us. Why? Because we're walking and talking in the joy of the Lord. And people have enough complaining. They heard it on their television. They saw it on their news feed. They're sick of it. And when you bring something that looks like light to them, you will radiate in such a way that brings everybody around you. And that alone can create opportunities for promotion. All by itself. Just walking in the joy of the Lord. But the enemy's coming after you. Here we go. I'll tell you one. Yesterday, we get up and my wife says, "Hey, do you want to go on a long trail?" Now, I don't know how things are in your house, but in my house, that's not a question. It's not a question. Do you want to? She says, "I'm going to run and you can ride the bike." It's not a question. It's right up there with, "Hey, do you want to go see the new Downton Abbey movie?" That's not a question. She knows I don't want to go see the Downton Abbey movie. She knows I don't care a thing about Downton Abbey. Do you want to? Of course I don't want to. You'll all be sitting around the dinner table. She poses the question, "Y'all want to go do fall pictures tomorrow?" No, we don't want to do fall pictures tomorrow. I don't want to go gather up to a bunch of pumpkins and smile. It's stupid. I don't like doing it. The kids don't like doing it. Everybody hates it. The B-roll gets thrown away. We have one picture where everybody looks like they're having a blast. And that's the one that we put out there, and we compare it to all the other parents that took pictures that got one good picture, and we all throw the B-roll away. I say, this is what we need to start doing. We need to start posting the real pictures, the miserable pictures, and then we'll stop this madness. We hate it. We all hate it. We all hate it. But when the question is posed, do you want to take fall pictures? There's a right answer. So, there I am riding my bike. I'm just going along, just enjoying the almost fall breeze. Pedaling. About mile 5, I see a pack of dogs and owner walks them by. Another pack of dogs, the owner walks them by. I'm like, "Oh, they're kind of cute." Another pack of dogs. The thing bit a hole in my leg. The stupid dog came off the sidewalk and bit a hole in my body. I was minding my own business. I was just almost enjoying the ride, almost enjoying the breeze, trying to find joy in life, and a dog attacked me. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. Your life will have moments where you are attacked for absolutely no reason. They just didn't like that you smiled. They just didn't like that you had joy in your belly. But we wrestle not against flesh and blood. They were willing to engage in the battle. They were willing to do what God was calling them to do so that they could see the fullness of the reward that God had for them to see. They crossed the Jordan River. They marched around the walls of Jericho. They even fought battles. But here's the thing. And this is where faith gets like we have to really keep this in perspective. God gave them the victory. He said, I sent the hornets before you, and I gave you the victory. In our attention economy, there is the temptation to want to take credit for the good things that God is doing in our lives, as if we, by our own strength or goodness or wisdom, achieved them. We can achieve nothing without the grace of God. And yet, without doing something, we never experience the grace. I mean, you would think I get a little credit for this, right? Like, come on, like, I won at least, give me 10%, Jesus. Let me brag about that 10%. I mean, we like encouragement. We like attaboys. We like to feel like we're like at least kind of awesome. And in the middle of God saying, you crossed the Jordan, and you marched around the walls, and you fought kings. But I sent the hornet, and I gave you the victory. Immediately, it forces us to not just live by what we call faith, but we live by faith with humility. Humility recognizes what God did first. And it keeps us from being arrogant. Habakkuk 2:4 says that when we have this arrogance, our soul is puffed up, and it's the opposite of faith because the just only live by faith. The righteous live by faith. Those who are arrogant and puffed up, they live in unrighteousness, but the righteous, so I'm not arrogant, I'm not puffed up, I live by faith. James chapter 4 and verse 6 says, God gives more grace. More grace. Therefore, it says that God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee. It's all in there. This whole life of faith is in there. I submit to God. I resist the devil. When I am tempted to puff myself up or be arrogant, in that moment, I'm resisting God, and I'm actually submitting to the devil. When I find myself submitting to the devil, I'm placing myself back in a place of darkness, and that will not lead me to victory. But when I submit to God, I'm resisting the devil. You can't submit to God without resisting the devil. I resist him so that I submit to God. What is that? It's humility. What does God give to the humble? Grace, more grace, more grace, more grace. But in the absence of that grace, I can't do the thing he's called me to do. And this is where we can sometimes in our conversation mix things up because we say, well, if God's doing it anyhow, then there's nothing that I need to do. False. No. You do it because he commanded you to do it. He'll give you the victory. Why? I don't even know. I would be perfect. I have no idea why God looked down at a pathetic group of people and decided to send his son to save them. Because I know for me personally, if I saw a group of pathetic people and somebody said, give your son for theirs. No. I'm not giving my child for that. No, the answer is no. Right? Like God all by himself said, I'll die for them. So I don't take the glory for any good work that I've done because I only did the good work because he commanded me to do it. And he only commanded me to do it because I'm his child. And I'm only his child because he sent his son for me. And so when we keep that in perspective, one, we keep from being judgmental about other people that are doing things dumb, but it keeps us even from being judgmental about ourselves because when we do something dumb, all we can do is fall on our face and repent. But because he tells us to get up and go do something right, then guess what? I'm going to get up and go do something right. I don't live in the shame of my mistakes because I'm keeping his word in front of me. That's what humility does. He said, I sent the hornet before you. Exodus chapter 23 and verse 28. God said, I will send. Now this is interesting. This was a prophecy. This is Moses speaking to Joshua. like 70 years before the moment when Joshua is repeating it at the end of his life. 70 years before that, he's hearing this in Exodus 23:28. God say through Moses, I will send the hornet before you, and he will drive out the Hivites and the Canaanites and the Hittites. He will drive them out before you, and little by little, you will increase and possess the land. One thing about humility, it submits to the timeline of God. There are things I would like today that I might have to wait a decade for. There are things that I should have to wait 2 decades for that he'll give me today. It makes no sense. Why? Because God decides. All by himself, God decides. And so I don't take glory and or credit for anything that I think I have done. I just walk in the blessing that he has given me. I've gotten there because I followed him. But by following him, it didn't give me any right for him to make it an offer that is available to me. Now, I've heard people sometimes talk about college scholarships like, I earned that. No, you didn't. You didn't earn the right to somebody decide to give you $20,000 to go to school. You met the qualifications that were required for you to have the money, but you didn't put the money up. Somebody that had the money decided to make that available for you. I'm glad you worked hard. I am. But more than being glad that you worked hard, I'm glad that they made it available because they didn't have to. And when we hold this in tension, we understand the relationship between grace and faith. But in the absence of humility, we'll have an arrogance that will pervert grace, or we'll live in an arrogance that will pervert faith. I don't do whatever I want to because I think grace has got me. And I don't rejoice in all of my doing because I think I've earned something. I just obey God. And when you obey God, God will lead you to the things that he has for you. He drove them out. And then I love this. In Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 10, another conversation that Moses was having. He says, when the Lord your God, he hadn't done it yet. They were all on the other side of the promised land. When the Lord your God brings you into the land with cities, good and great cities that you did not build, and houses full of good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. And when you have eaten and you are full, take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the house of slavery. Now here's a typical cycle in the life of a Christian. We're suffering a little bit. Things aren't what we think they should be, so we draw near to God. Why do we draw near to God? Because we don't have something that we need. We know he has everything, so I draw near to him because he has what I need. I serve him, I love him, I follow him. All of the sudden, that service and loving kindness brings me to the blessing. Now I live in the blessing, I enjoy the blessing, and the blessing is enough. Now no longer do I want him. What happened? I didn't learn back here that man shall not live by bread alone, but man will live by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. I didn't learn that back here. I should have learned it, but I didn't. And then when I get over here where I'm eating milk and honey, now all of a sudden I don't remember that man does not live by bread alone, but every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Now I'm satisfied with milk and honey, and I forget the Lord. So now as I forget the Lord and follow my own way leads me back to destruction. I find myself back in a place of suffering. Now I'm not what I want. Now I lean back into God, and leaning into God, I experience the blessing. The blessing gives me the things that I want. Now if I didn't figure it out this time, what happens? I'll just go repeat the process. And then in the middle of the process, I'll say, well, I don't know why God keeps doing this. Really? Really? Take care lest you forget. So now Joshua is in the middle of the promised land in a place of prosperity, and he doesn't say, yes, look what we did. Yeah. It's football season, I'm sorry. He says, hey, you do what you want to do. Not everybody's going to live this out. There will be those people who will give up too soon. There will be those people who walk away from what God has given them. There were those people who just, the fight's not worth it to them. He says, choose you this day. You make your decision. But regardless of what you do, I'm not moved by you, not moved by circumstances. You do your thing. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So let's wrap this up. So last month, the end of July, I had the honor of preaching to the youth at youth camp. And it was the second night. It was a Monday night. And Ben was on stage, and Stephen and the band were on stage, and they're just worshiping. And I'm just watching these kids like press in to the presence of God. And I'm just in the back, and Pastor Reggie's over to the side, and Eric and Kevin and Jonathan, just men of God lining the walls. Women of God lining the walls. Men and women of God on stage. Men and women of God in a room just giving God glory, just wanting all that God has for them, desiring for God to show so they can know, so they can go. So, I mean, it's just so amazing. And in the middle of that moment, for me, it just became a quiet moment. And I believe I heard the word of the Lord whisper to me and say, this is a Joshua generation. And I pondered that for weeks. Like, is it the youth? Like, are they? Is like what is it? And it wasn't until last week I had a few conversations with some different ones, disturbing conversations. And I saw the contrast in a moment. And what I realized was this, not an age bracket, not a location, this, where there are men and women of God pursuing all that God has for them, regardless of where they are economically, regardless of race, regardless of age, regardless of any of it. When a group of people just pursue God, that is a Joshua generation. And the thing is, when we pursue God, when we wait on Him to experience all that He has for us, when we take the time to just stop and listen, God, give me direction. When I don't know where to go, I don't understand how to raise these kids, I don't realize, should I apply for this? Should I not apply for this? And God says, no, apply for it. So I apply for it. And they say no. He says, no, that one's yours. So I no longer pray. I begin to declare, this one's mine. This one's mine. I won't take no. I'm not waiting for the door. I'll kick it if I have to. I'll bang on it if I have to. But I'm going in to the fullness of what God has for me. The walls are up. The walls are saying stay out, but I'm not staying out. I'm marching around them until they fall down, because God said that city is mine. And when He said it's mine, it's mine. And if He has to make the sun stand still, then He can give me the declaration, and I'll just say, sun, stand still. And I'll watch it stand still, and I'll see God move, and I'll see everybody else see God move, and all of us will just rejoice, and we'll find ourselves living in the middle of the promised land, eating milk and honey, with a declaration that says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That is a Joshua generation. And that invitation is for every single one of us. Is that the people that you will be?